very similar to Fiona, APSE regularly surveys our member authorities to find out what it is that is creating the issues for them. Our latest workforce survey finds that 76% of our member authorities within Scotland cite pay as the main factor both in recruitment and retention of staff. There is some good news in that for Scottish local government. It's 82% on a UK-wide basis, so it's marginally less of a factor here, but nonetheless a huge issue. APSE's Local Government Commission also explored this matter, and I know Mr Coffey referred to that earlier. One of the main things that came through the expert witnesses to our commission was a distinct lack of comprehensive workforce planning in local authorities. And again, that was on a UK-wide basis, but in part that does consistently cite the inability to plan long-term for the workforce because of the short-term nature of local government finance. So those two things are absolutely interconnected. And both before the pandemic and after the pandemic, we're seeing demand increasing on services. Accepting Mr McKee's questionings around those workforce numbers, underlying that is actually demand-side increases. We're seeing an increase in child poverty issues, an increase in the older population and therefore adults in need of more complex care. So the whole host of factors, the green economy, local authorities are doing fantastic work in striving to get to net zero, but there are new skills needed, construction, how to put solar panels on properties. Those skills lag behind. So the demand base for local authorities has shifted very significantly over, I would say, the last decade. And that we see as one of the main factors in terms of those workforce issues. Thank you. I agree with all of the comments from colleagues on the panel. There's one element that I think we could turbocharge the New Deal with, and that's looking really seriously at a general power of competence for local government in Scotland. It's something that has been looked at on several occasions. I don't believe for 1 minute that the Scottish Government is taking a view of trying to hold back local authorities, but the current legal powers available to local authorities are being interpreted by the courts as opposed to by government and government will. So we have a nervousness in local authorities about how they can act in a more collaborative way, a nervousness about how they can act in a more collaborative way with partners in the private sector or other parts of the public sector. And actually some data we have going back to an analysis we did at 2018-19 on an area such as neighbourhood services and local authority parks, significantly less buoyant income in those areas. Councils that have been able to achieve additional resources through income generation are the very same councils that can then invest in their workforce using that income. This is profit for a purpose. It isn't profit to make casino bankers out of local authority chief executives. It's a sensible measure. So I think alongside the warm words in the New Deal, we could turbocharge that with some a general power of competence for local authorities.
Great, thanks very much for that.
What's your own views, especially in senior positions in local government? How representative do you think that cohort, that group of people are of the communities that they actually represent day to day, and what could we do to try and rebalance it if that's an issue? Maybe start with Mo, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr Coffey. Yes, a very good question. And again, it was one we considered in our commission report. And what we found was the representative element of, are you truly representative of local government has to be asked on two levels. One is local councils themselves. Are they reflective of communities? And in a party political system with different elements of selection processes, that can be very, very difficult to achieve. However, as employers with the workforce, it is possible to look at the demographics of the local area and look at how you are achieving that representation and looking outwards to communities to engage proactively in how you recruit people, because often there is a tendency, particularly in sort of professional level jobs, to go through the usual channels, which is, a job advert in The Guardian. One of the things we recommended in our commission was actually an approach to grow your own. Put people on career pathways, have that talent spotting process, put people on career pathways, invest in training and development to change the structures and the face of senior leadership roles in local government. There is much more diversity in lower paid jobs, but that of itself is a problem. we are segregating people into low paid work by gender if you're a woman. We're segregating people into lower paid work if you're from a BAME community, and that really is unacceptable in 2023. So we have to do much more to end job segregation in local authorities, but we also have to do much more to change the face of professionals within local authorities. I did an equalities review for a North West of England authority a couple of years ago, and amongst a senior management cohort that, you know, probably got to about 55 people, there were less than 3 BAME managers, and that was in an area where the local population would have reached around 6% of BAME communities in the local population, which was relatively low for that particular conurbation, but still not good enough. And one of the interviews with a member of staff who was looking after a group of activists among staff to try and embed change, said, you know, how can we instill in people the ambition to become a senior manager when none of the senior management team look like I do? And that was a really powerful testament to that level of ambition that we need to reach in local government.
Well, thanks for that, Mo. Other question was on the gender pay gap issue that you may have heard in the other couple of sessions as well. Just to ask for your perspective on that. Is it improving? Is it still there? Is it worsening? Just what's your own experience? Maybe go back to Mo again and start there.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Again, going back to that issue of segregation of roles in local authorities, we can strive very hard to implement, equal pay-proofed pay and grading structures. We can strive very, very hard to ensure that pay-to-points relationships are robust and a job evaluated in a technical scheme. But we will still see a glut of predominantly part-time women workers who are stuck in low-paid professions. We need to break down the segregation between job roles. APSE has done a lot of work to encourage particularly women into construction through apprenticeship programmes. I have to say our member authorities in Scotland again are way, way ahead of other areas of the UK in terms of apprenticeship development, and particularly apprenticeships in construction. But we need to go further and faster. I don't believe we can solve equal pay simply by having a technical approach to that pay-to-points relationship. We've got to look at the societal issues. And one area that we picked up on during the COVID pandemic, again another APSE workforce survey on post-COVID return to work, was we found that there was a very genderised impact of COVID. Encouragement in some quarters that women could stay at home because actually it reduced childcare costs and they could manoeuvre their careers around childcare. So there's a big issue there around investment in professional childcare for working women. And again, that is something that hasn't been, in our view, sufficiently part of the discourse in terms of addressing those gender pay gaps. That, you know, technically we can look and say some of those pay gaps are lessening, and that's a tribute to the work of our member local authorities in local government. But on the whole, that segregation of job roles is still a fundamental barrier to truly achieving equalities for women. Very briefly, because I think Councillor Short covered APSE's perspective perfectly there. We do not offer or sell enough the value-based proposition of a career in local government, and the competition for jobs that comes through from our members, for filling jobs rather from our members. It isn't just the private sector, it's other areas of the public sector. We know that we lose chief executives, we lose accountants to the NHS. They are seen as better in the concept of the public. But I think in terms of that ageing workforce issue, we should be selling a value-based proposition to younger workers, not just school leavers, but people coming from a college, offering them career pathways. I've yet to meet a young person coming out of college and saying, I want to make loads of money from everybody. Young people nowadays tend to be really concerned about climate change, they're concerned about social value issues, they're concerned about giving something back to society. And I think local government ticks all of those boxes, but we're incredibly poor at selling that value-based proposition, particularly to younger people. So I think, you know, we have to take responsibility for that as a sector, and we have to sell ourselves better.
I just wanted to pick up on the Accounts Commission. In their report, they highlighted the overall absence levels for non-teaching staff in 2021 to 22, that they were the highest on record. And I just would like to hear what your thoughts are around what are the key drivers of that increase, and what could local authorities do to support staff to reduce the rates of absence. And maybe I'll start with Mo.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think the figure cited earlier was 12.5%. Whilst I took advantage of being at the back of the room and emailed to get some figures from APSE's Performance Network's data sets, which have been collected now for over 25 years. So I've looked at some of the figures and the average figures for our member authorities in Scotland across different services. There seems to be some inflation in those figures, and I think that possibly the calculation of those figures includes long-term absence. So an example for the committee, in cemeteries and crematoria services, the overall absence level is 11.2%. When you take out long-term absence, that comes in at 5.5%. In an area like catering, the all-service average for the UK is 12.5. Within Scotland, it's just 4.67. But that, again, excluding long-term absence, drops to 2.4%. So there are very differential figures for different services, and I think it's important that we don't hone in on a headline grabbing figure, but actually understand the granular level detail for those absences. Part of the issue that local authorities, in our experience, absence management can be done really, really well in terms of offering support for people, but also, there is a little bit of a carrot and stick approach to good absence management. It's unfair on other staff if people are off and it's not justifiable, but equally, where it is justifiable, how do we support those workers to get them back into work? And unfortunately, we do come across delays in things like occupational health support, and of course, the impact of delays in the NHS has to be factored in. If somebody's waiting a procedure, maybe a surgical intervention from the NHS, that will impact on the figures. And the cohort of local government in terms of relatively low pay, amongst quite a big chunk of it, means that they are not the people that can bypass the NHS and go and buy those treatments privately. So we will see a higher level of absence generally amongst lower paid workers, but I don't think we should lump everybody in the same category, and we need to take cognizance of longer term absences that need a separate management approach to short term absence.
Thanks again, Convener. It's to ask the same question asked the previous two panels about the ageing workforce issue. I mean, we heard that we've got an ageing workforce within local government, but we're also hearing that local government workers retire early, and the previous panellists tried to explain the dynamic of why that should be. Does it all of that imply that we need to do more to try and recruit younger people to come into the workforce to replace? I know it's difficult to do because you need the experience in a huge number of posts in local government, but what's your own perspective in this, and what we can do to try and turn that round? We'll start with Mo again, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Yes, absolutely. And one of the really obvious issue with the ageing workforce is that even when we have people retiring, it's just other people in the workforce who themselves are getting older. So there's a natural progression of an ageing workforce. Scotland, based on your official statistics, appears to be doing better again than elsewhere in the UK in terms of bringing younger people into local government. But I think there is an absolute necessity to preserve some of the skills. So what we've lost in local government, I'll give you an example of a parks manager I was speaking to last December at our Performance Network seminar. And he said they no longer have the skills to maintain bowling greens, bowling pitches, because actually the old park keepers that had that very specialist work have all left. And a couple of the guys had actually come back in their own time to teach some of the younger people, how it needed to be done. But we lose those skills to pass on to the next generation. So I think there's a huge gap there, and managing retirements in a much more flexible way would be incredibly helpful to pass on some of those skills. But again, in terms of the skill shortages, grow your own is a really good policy, but it's incredibly expensive because you're doubling up in time, in productive time, to train somebody up to eventually be able to do that job on their own 2 feet. So it's a very expensive approach. And for many authorities, it's a luxury they don't feel they've got, particularly in some of the neighbourhood services where it's been unequal misery in terms of the reductions in overall spending power in those services. So there's quite a difference emerging in some of those frontline service skills, and that's coming through from APSE's own data. So a grow your own approach in ideal circumstances, but unfortunately it is expensive to do, and we do lack a workforce plan strategy that's pan-local government to achieve those aims. Thank you very much for the question. Many of the points have been covered, but we have just launched with the Town and Country Planning Association a research report on planning and its ability to deliver on climate change. And unless we get planning right, we will not achieve net zero. And some of the ambitions in terms of looking at how we green future developments is absolutely critical if we're to achieve those ambitions. I would, however, say, very much agreeing with Fiona on this, there is not just a shortage within Scotland of planners, there is a UK-wide shortage. That was very clear from the TCPA research. I think universities have should have an answer to this. There's been a complete lack of investment at the university level in planning-related disciplines. It became a not particularly attractive option, so we have lost that. I would also say, in terms of that issue of funding and funding cuts, this is one of the areas where non-statutory related, not capped fees, but advisory work that could be done using a general power of competence, charging for those services, let developers pay a little bit more in order to generate some income into that and hopefully improve the planning service. There's been case law in the past around, planning and planning charges and how far local authorities can push the parameters on that. I think this is an area where we should be looking at a greater degree of more commercial thinking in terms of what income could be achieved by providing salient and good quality professional advice that in turn would support the future of the service in terms of developing the planners of tomorrow.
I suppose the questions are, number one, in terms of mechanisms to support innovation, do you feel that that's strong enough and embedded enough in that culture of looking for opportunities to improve is there? And then number two, looking to the future, what kind of work is going on to try and understand what local authority of the future and the workforce planning of the future could look like? And just to throw in, I'm very interested more in this general power of competence, so you might want to kind of touch on that in your answer and the scope that offers and what would need to happen to take that forward through legislation or other mechanisms. So I'll just throw that out there and let you answer as you see fit.
Do you want me to
Whoever.
take this first?
On you go.
Thank you. In terms of innovation, I don't think there's any lack of ambition amongst our member local authorities. As Councillor Short mentioned, last week we were in Belfast. There was over 250 representatives of local authorities there, and the whole event was around sharing innovation and best practice. I don't think there's a lack of ambition amongst local authorities, but they are hidebound by the resources that they have. And particularly for APSE, our concentration is unashamedly on frontline services. And what's happened to the way in which those resources are distributed is the protection of statutory services in terms of education, in terms of social care, has meant that there has been this very unequal and lumpy settlement in terms of neighbourhood services. So the services that people see when they step out of their front door are the very services that actually have been hit hardest through the era of austerity and beyond. So for those services, their workforce planning looks very, very different, because what they've had to do is crisis manage reductions in staffing, crisis manage some of the skill shortages in those areas. They are now lifting their heads up above the parapet a bit more and saying, what can we do differently? So there's open discussions there about environmental apprenticeships. There's open discussions around looking at green skills and can people move between departments, but also now move between authorities to pick up skills. So things like being able to maintain EV assets, fleet assets, or maintain hydrogen. Those are new skills that will come forward. So workforce planning, in APSE's view and based on our research, has got to address not where we're at now with local government, but looking in 5 years' time, what will the skills be that we need to meet. In terms of where that ties into this general power of competence, I think looking at some of our data, the buoyancy of income generation for some areas of neighbourhood services has been stymied by a fear that if they do things that they then push the boundary, they're acting in an ultra-vires way, will they be open to challenge? So the purpose of a general power of competence is to really give people a power of first resort. It does not prevent Scottish Government saying to councils, you know, this is not a backward power where you can start doing things that we've previously debarred. Charging for collection of domestic waste would be an obvious one. It's not allowing councils to suddenly generate new taxes and charge for things that we've not previously charged for, but it does allow innovation, and it does allow better cooperation and coordination across local authority boundaries. It's not limited to the concept of well-being. It says basically, if you or I can go out and do something innovative, and we're not ripping people off and we're not putting people at risk, and it's done with due regard to health and safety, those are things that we can do. And part of our argument as APSE has been, please make sure that you talk to local businesses. This isn't about putting the local window cleaner out of a business or putting a local gardener out of a business, but let's look, where can we expand that innovation and actually get a little bit of income generation into local authorities to help meet that resource gap? To add to that, we've done a lot of data work around the skills shortages, and the figures for Scotland are really quite stark. So 58% are reporting shortages of HGV drivers, 41% on all other drivers, in highways and street lighting 47%, construction is at 39%. So these are really stark figures of councils struggling to recruit, and the only way they will do that is if they bring in people at apprenticeship levels and train people themselves. The complaints from our member authorities is the mismatch in the courses on offer in traditional FE sector and certainly university sector. So it's not something that's that easily joined up. So one authority, and this was a member authority in Scotland who will remain nameless, but they were looking at training EV technicians, and they basically had to approach a private sector garage that would be able to, they had some skilled people doing that to effectively develop their own course. It wasn't something that was on offer in a traditional, mechanics training course at the local FE. So councils are being innovative in this area, but they really do struggle, that mismatch between what is on offer in current formal structures and what they need in terms of those frontline service skills.